For over 70 years, British comedy has woven itself into the fabric of our national consciousness, creating stars and helping to shape the universal television viewing experience. Comedy can be as diverse and wide-ranging as life itself, and British comedy's rich landscape epitomizes this. So please, don't adjust your set. We'll take it from here if you're not being served, as we explore the wide-ranging and often bizarre world of British comedy with some of its best-loved stars exclusively on Beyond the Title.
Hello.
Turn the recording on. So, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
I'm Tom. This is Josh.
Hello, Josh. Nice to meet you, Josh. Nice to meet you, Tom.
You too. And just to explain quickly, I'm here just as Josh's voice, basically. Josh
Okay.
writes the questions. It's all his own research. Any mistakes are solely Josh's and not mine. And he always gets it wrong. But, so we'll go through the questions. Josh might have some extra bits, which I'll tell you what he said. And yeah, happy to start, Josh? It's a good job he's the right Adam Buxton. Is there another? You've had one before where you got completely the wrong person. Yeah. Well, he definitely looks like the right Adam Buxton to me, so I think we're all right.
Good. I wasn't aware there was a duplicate Adam Buxton. Hey, by the way, sorry to be late, and also thank you for letting me start a little bit earlier. Something came up at 1, and I wanted to make sure we had enough time.
Absolutely fine with us. Thank you very much for being here. Right, we'll begin. So let's go back to the start. You met Joe Cornish at the Independent School in Westminster. What were your first impressions of him?
Joe was good fun. I mean, Westminster is a public school, fee-paying school in the centre of London that I scraped into through a kind of back door because I don't think I had the right academic qualifications to get in there. It's quite a high-powered school, and my dad was delighted when he managed to sort of get me in there, I think on a slightly cheaper rate if I was going to start later, like a term later. And for about a year or 2 years, I think maybe, I really hated it. I thought it was awful. I didn't like the fact there was no girls there. I'd been at a co-ed school before then, and I really missed having girls around. And a lot of the boys were quite obnoxious and entitled and unpleasant and talked about sport and cars, which I couldn't give a shit about. Are you okay with swearing, by the way?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I didn't like it. And Joe was one of the first people who seemed a little bit more interesting and funny. And he liked music and films, which I was into as well. He liked a band called the Thompson Twins, which not too many other people were really excited about at the time, but I was one of them. And we bonded over comedy. There was a show called Not the 9 O'Clock News, and we'd seen a sketch on there with a couple of secret agents meeting in a park, talking in a kind of coded series of exchanges. You know, the winter is very cold this year, but I think the ducks will be back before September, and that kind of thing. And so we would talk like that to each other without really saying anything proper. We'd just exchange weird coded Russian spy messages. And I thought, oh yeah, I like this guy. He seems nice. And then we went to see a film called, well, it was a Monty Python film that had just come out, and it was The Meaning of Life. And it was very exciting because it was an 18, and we were not 18 at that point. We were 16, I think, maybe even younger, 15. Anyway, Joe reviewed films for LBC, I think it was, London radio, and somehow he'd got a job as a film reviewer for LBC. So he got free tickets to movies. It just seemed like a impossibly glamorous and privileged level of access that Cornish had somehow wangled. And so I rode along on his coattails, and we formed our friendship that way.
Lovely. One of your first TV vehicles was on the Channel 4 show Takeover TV. What do you remember about that show?
Well, Takeover TV was a public access show that was on Channel 4 in the mid-90s, I guess. Yeah, I think 1995 it started. And while I was at art school in the early 90s, I'd sent off a load of tapes of some of my work, because I made a lot of video art when I was at art school. I mean, I say video art. It was like just me being a dick, and sometimes I would make a kind of sculptural object to locate the TV monitor to show the video of me clowning around so that it looked a bit more like art. But I mean, I'm putting myself down. It was half great art and half great comedy. It was the best of both worlds. And so I sent some of my stuff into this show, Takeover TV, because I saw an ad in the NME asking for tapes that were sort of funny or quirky or anything homemade, home video stuff for a new show. And I got a message back from the production company, which was World of Wonder. They really liked the tapes. And I also sent in some of the stuff that I used to do with Joe. You know, we always would get together and film stuff on the weekends and mainly reconstruct other people's sketches, like Monty Python sketches or Not the 9 O'Clock News. Those were the big ones that we really liked. And we'd sort of recreate those. And so I sent in some other things that we'd done, not recreations of other people's sketches, but just stuff of me and Joe fooling around, and got a good response back from Takeover TV. And I ended up presenting a couple of episodes and got Joe involved. So it was really valuable. And it was back in the days when there was nothing else like that around. You know, TV was this it was like a impenetrable fortress of professionalism. How the hell do you get on TV? You know what I mean? Like the only way you could get on TV was to win a competition or be on the news or something like that. Otherwise, it just seemed this really mysterious world where somehow people had gained access to it. So to actually be on TV in those days as a normal, quote, normal person was very rare. And they did have some public access shows, but it was usually people talking about like, like council, why aren't the council picking up the bins at the right times and things like that. Having their say, being part of the democratic process rather than actually being creative or funny or weird. And that's what Takeover TV was encouraging people to do. So it was quite fun. And we got a chance to try out a lot of ideas that we ended up using in our TV show, in the Adam and Joe show. Takeover TV was where we first used Star Wars figures to recreate. Well, actually, we weren't recreating TV shows. We were just doing little skits about what it would be like to be in the Star Wars universe.
What do you think it is about that is related so much to
What do you think it is about art that's related so much to comedy?
I suppose it is the upending of expectations. That's what comedy relies on. It relies on steering an audience somewhere, and they think they know where they're going, and then at the last minute you pull the rug out from under them, and it's fun and they like it, and the surprise is what is enjoyable for the audience. And I think you're doing that with art a lot of the time as well. You're sort of turning things upside down or tearing away the veil of the familiar from everyday life and just saying, have you ever looked at this thing this way? And doesn't the world look different when you come at it from a different perspective? And that's a fun thing to see. That's why I quite like, you know, like in the world of comedy, sometimes observational comedians get a hard time. I really like Stuart Lee, the comedian, but he's often laying into observational comedy because I think he feels it's a bit of a hack to just point things out and say, oh, look, that's what you do. That's my routine. But actually, I really quite like observational comedy. I like people, when it's done well, you know, a good Michael McIntyre routine or a good Seinfeld routine or whoever it happens to be, you know. I think most comedians do observational comedy at some point, but they might just be more skillful at it and dress it up and be more arty with it. But I really like that, you know. I like that sort of shift in perspective that you get with art and observational comedy.
That's very, very Bob Monk.
A bit like Bob Monkhouse.
He
He was a cartoonist, and then the cartoon became joke. Yeah.
Yeah. Bob Monkhouse was good because he had that thing that Jerry Seinfeld has, which was a kind of fascination with the mechanics of comedy and the science of comedy, how jokes work, and that desire to, you know, archive them. He had all his books, he set them all down. He was really approaching it like a psychologist. You know, why do these things make us laugh? How does it work? And, you know, superficially, if you don't dig into Bob Monkhouse and his career, he would be one of those people, perhaps a bit like Michael McIntyre, although I don't really know that much about Michael McIntyre, who comes off as a bit cheesy and a bit obvious and a bit mainstream. But actually, there's often a lot more to them. If you do those things well, and if you have an appreciation for the science of it, I like that.
Josh has actually seen the books, the Bob Monkhouse books.
Have you?
Yeah.
You're a big fan, Josh, aren't you? They're amazing. They're full of little drawings as well. Yeah.
Oh, I love all that. I love looking, notebooks, sketchbooks, all those things that offer you a glimpse into how somebody's mind works are great. That was the first thing we got taught at art school, was keep a sketchbook, write everything down. And I think you realize quite quickly, if you want to do anything creative, certainly if it's anything to do with language or ideas, which most things are, then you have to write it all down. Like, even if it seems pretty useless, if a thought occurs to you and there's something interesting about it, if you write it down, then you can come back to it like 10 years later sometimes, and suddenly it'll hit you differently because you've probably become a different person in the intervening time. So you'll read an idea back and you'll think, oh, I know what to do with that now. It makes sense to me. And it's like a message sent to you from the past, from the person you used to be, to say, well, look, is this anything? I don't really know what to do with it at the moment, but here's a gift to you, 10 years older self, and maybe you can make it work.
At uni, we had to do free writing where we had to write whatever came into our heads for 10 minutes, like a stream of consciousness.
think that's a good way of like, uh, mm,
And you think that's a good way of coming at it?
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All that stuff that encourages you not to be too precious, not too self-conscious, because the older you get, the more you tend to kind of build up your layers of self-consciousness and your defenses and your anxieties about not wanting to be caught out or not made to look foolish. Anyway, that's how I see it. And so, yeah, anything that encourages you just to let things out, not be too precious, not be too embarrassed if you try something that's a bit crap or not particularly funny or interesting. Just, you know, see where it goes.
Britain has enjoyed a long history of successful double acts from Morecambe and Wise to Vic and Bob. What was it about your relationship with Joe which made you realise you could offer something different?
Well, that's nice to think that we offered something different. I mean, well, maybe what we offered was a slightly worse version of the other people that you were talking about. We were we were trying, I think, to be serious though, without putting myself down unnecessarily, I suppose we did feel that we weren't comedians in that mold. We did feel that we were outside of that. We were more like fans and we were more like nerds. We were interested in pop culture. We loved films, we loved comedy. But I don't think we felt part of that world. So we were commenting on it rather than actually being part of it. You know, like it was the Adam and Joe show was more like a review program rather than a pure sketch comedy show or anything like that. You know, it was commenting on what was happening. And I suppose that's what we wanted to offer. We wanted to offer something that was going to be relatable to other fans. Because when you're a fan, you're excited about the object of your fandom, but you're also aware of its faults and you're also quite critical sometimes. And, you know, like me and Joe always loved David Bowie. And so we would talk about Bowie a lot, but as much as I love him and always have done, you know, there were lots of parts of David Bowie's career that were quite silly, and he did some funny, ridiculous film roles, and he would occasionally say ludicrous things like we all do. And he would do it in quite a funny way with an enjoyable accent. And he would use words like superlative and theatricality. I mean, theatricality is a word. I don't know about superlative, but we always liked it when he would say things like that, and it bonded us to laugh about those things, but hopefully not in a way that was horrible. So we wanted to have that kind of affectionate, piss-taking feel to the Adam and Joe show, and to have it be a comment that was sort of funny, like a funny review show, I guess, maybe.
In 1996, you landed your own Channel 4 show. In the era of the Britpop movement, what sort of motivation was there amongst the comedy community of the time to reflect the social rebellion that Britpop had sparked?
Well, God, I mean, I don't remember. We weren't very political at all back then. Not that we're especially political now, me and Joe. Or rather, we don't talk about politics too much when we're together in a comedic setting. I think we're both more interested and more engaged now than we would have been back in the 90s. You know, when Blair got in 97, that was really the beginning of me being aware that politics was something that affected my life, I'm ashamed to say. Before then, I'd been cocooned from it and had a very nice, cozy upbringing in the 80s, which for people like me wasn't an especially political decade. Didn't feel like it to me, right? Like to other people, of course, they were, you know, on picket lines and dealing with Thatch and all that kind of thing. But I always preferred stuff that was sillier and more about everyday life, I suppose, than directly political stuff, probably because I didn't really understand the politics. Anyway, so that's a roundabout way of saying that me and Joe were still very much in that kind of pop culture obsessed, everyday observational mode when we were doing the Adam and Joe show. So we didn't feel comfortable weighing in on kind of socio-political things. I suppose more broadly culturally speaking, though, we did want to take the piss out of some things that we thought was just stupid and embarrassing. And there is a kind of political dimension to some of those things. You know, culture has a political dimension because of the values that it includes at any point. Attitudes to race and women and class and all sorts of things. You can find all those things in movies, of course, and TV at any point. So in a kind of indirect way, I suppose we were commenting on some of those things, like with a film like Fight Club, for example, at the end of the 90s. Now you think about that film and it's so prescient in a lot of bad ways about where things have gone with kind of masculinity, conflicted feelings of toxic masculinity and men's place in society and how they feel they should behave, the kind of Andrew Tate strain of male identity. A lot of that is in Fight Club. And at the time, it was a film that a lot of people were really excited about and thought was really cool and exciting and edgy. And the 90s, there was a strain of kind of enthusiasm for edgy culture and edgy behavior that I think me and Joe and people like us always felt quite suspicious of and excluded from, and thought was just stupid and bollocks. So we would occasionally take the piss out of it, I think, but in a kind of, in a sort of oblique way rather than a very direct way, like someone like Ben Elton, for example. I always felt like when Ben Elton would do his political routines, for me, they felt too on the nose, you know what I mean? Now, he's much more in step. I don't know, is that true? I'm not sure. But maybe now Ben Elton's much more direct political routines feel more in step with where we are now when people want to be more direct about politics. But I don't know, I mean...
Got to be a bit careful because Ben Elton is a friend of the podcast, but I feel that sometimes his material is a bit contradictory to what he then became.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert. I think he's a fascinating guy. Obviously, he's been responsible for a lot of amazing comedy over the years. But I don't know, if you're a political animal, that's always going to be the case, isn't it? I think if you express strong political opinions and express a strong opinion about something that's current, you're always going to be at risk of being tripped up or changing your mind. I think you're allowed to change your mind as well, aren't you? Are you talking about more like him changing his values in a more fundamental way, Josh?
He started really, he as the year went on, he
I think he started off as being very anti-establishment, but as the years went by, he became part of the establishment.
Right, there you go. Well, that's always a risk, isn't it? How do you avoid that? I can't pretend that I don't feel the pull of the establishment. I've been able to avoid that problem by not being more popular. But if I was, if I was sort of invited to tea with the king or something like that, I don't know, would I go? I'm not sure. Louis Theroux I saw the other day, and he was invited to tea with the king. And he imagined that he was going to go to the king's house and they'd just sit together and have a chinwag. And of course, it turned out to be more like a garden party situation where there were hundreds of people, some celebrities, but a lot of people who were just had achieved things in their local communities and then been invited to be part of this royal garden party. And I think Louis wanted to go along and see what it was like. And his wife is much more of a Republican, Louis's wife. And she was quite shocked that he would go. And she just thought, why do you want to go and see the king? And Louis was like, well, why don't you want to go and see the king? He's a thing, whether you like the monarchy or not, he's an interesting person, part of an interesting, albeit controversial system. And Louis is fundamentally a curious person who's interested in the world and interested in people. So you sort of think, well, yeah, why not? I'll go and have a look. But there's a fine line between that, I suppose, and finding yourself co-opted and, oh, look, me and the king are getting on really well. Let's go on a shooting weekend. And, oh, wow, look who's on the shooting weekend. It's Vladimir Putin. No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that King Charles goes shooting with Vladimir Putin. You know what I'm trying to say.
But you get now and with young look you like the great.
Do you get now where, as an older comedian, younger comedians look at you as like the Holy Grail?
I wouldn't say the Holy Grail, but sometimes I get a gratifying level of respect and admiration from people I really admire. Like I met Jamie Demetriou, who does Stathlet's Flats. And I remember the first time I met him, he was really complimentary about the Adam and Joe show in a way that was very flattering. And I mean, on the one hand, I'm not so insecure that I can't take the compliment and say, yeah, okay, fair enough. I'm glad you liked it. We tried really hard. I'm glad you thought it worked in parts. But on the other hand, I do think that part of the secret of succeeding in anything you do is just carrying on living. And if you carry on doing it long enough, then you kind of accrue a kind of semblance of knowing what you're doing or something, or maybe that, I don't know. Yeah. Just surviving seems to be impressive for some people.
The 90s was a time of great optimism for the country, which was a stark contrast to the previous decade. With this in mind, how did your generation go about finding the funny in a nation of optimism?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I suppose, as I said before, there was a lot to be silly about because things were so optimistic and so positive. I think, everyone always gets excessive, don't they? Like whatever the situations are, if things are very restrictive in society, then people push against that. And if people are very free, then they take advantage of that freedom and go way too far with it. And, in the last few years, with attitudes to so many things changing culturally, people of my generation certainly look back at what we were doing in the 90s and cringe quite a bit because we hadn't really, we thought we were all kind of liberal, groovy people, basically with our hearts in the right place. And we felt like everyone was on the same page about certain things, about like racism is bad, sexism is bad, we should be getting on as a species, you shouldn't pollute the planet. Those kinds of things felt like everyone agreed. And so you felt as if you could take the piss and be a bit more edgy and make jokes like that were superficially sexist or something, because you felt that you were adopting a slightly ironic position. You felt like, well, we understand that sexism is bad, but having said that, here's like a callback to what sexism used to be like that maybe you'll find funny. But looking back on that now, of course, it seems quite weird. And it seems weird that we hadn't thought harder about how those things would age. I'm not really answering your question, though. As far as finding the funny in an optimistic decade, of course, there were just lots. Whether a decade is remembered as being optimistic or not, at the time, there's still all sorts of shit kicking off, and there's still loads of things to be funny about or take the piss out of. You know, bad films are always being made. Bad music is always coming out. Ridiculous people are always in the media. I mean, the whole Britpop scene was ridiculous, and the whole level of optimism about, swinging Britannia, whatever it was called, was obviously stupid at the time. And I think that we were aware of that, you know, and that was funny. And yeah, Spice Girls and Girl Power, as good, as exciting as those things were on some level, and you'd prefer it to like everything being absolutely dour, it was still ridiculous. And so there was lots of fun to be had with all that. And that whole kind of loaded culture and TFI Friday and all of those things, you know, you could enjoy them. And I did like a lot of those things in some ways, but they were so excessive and so stupid that it was fun to be silly about them too.
Is it true that you once asked Jules Holland how long his typical wanking session was?
I don't remember saying that. It's not it sounds like something I might have said once upon a time. Where did you get that from?
Josh knows the story.
I remember when you just were your house of glass and you had a robot and it was asking
Josh remembers when you were doing the show at Glastonbury and you had a robot and it was asking celebrities random questions.
Oh. Did we interview Jules? I forgot.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the robot asked him how long his typical wanking session was, apparently.
Well, I'm very sorry then. But that was Musox. That was our robot. And we had a robot made out of a bin that I had constructed, and I had a little mini disc player that was connected to a speaker in the robot. And so we were doing coverage for BBC Choice, I think it was then, in the BBC compound at Glastonbury. And when you're backstage there, you've got celebrities kind of wandering through who are doing interviews elsewhere. And me and Joe would stand and just try and grab interesting looking people. And so we got Orbital and Tajinder Singh from Corner Shop, I remember, and Badly Drawn Boy and people like that. And I guess we got Jules, although I had forgotten that. And we also interviewed Rolf Harris, but that's a whole other story. But yes, I suppose it is possible that via Musox, the robot, and one of the questions that I had recorded onto this mini disc, which I then set on shuffle when we were interviewing people. It is possible that one of those questions was wanking based, and that makes me cringe. And I'm sorry to Jules Holland for asking him about that.
yeah, oh,
Did you ever get
oh,
an answer?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, surely not. If I was asked that question, I don't think I would answer that question.
In 2015, you created the Adam Buxton podcast. At a time when the podcast format wasn't as crowded as it is today, why do you think you're so suited to the medium? How do you think your background in radio helped you nurture your podcast style?
Oh, well, it was vital. I think it came off the back of doing a radio show on Six Music with Joe Cornish. And we got into radio in the early 2000s because we were finding it hard to get on TV, I think. We didn't really know what to do after the Adam and Joe show finished. We did the last series in 2001. And basically, we wanted to carry on making that program because we thought, well, we could do this forever, really. Just comment on popular culture. There's always going to be popular culture. And anyway, Channel 4 weren't into that. So we spent a few years being a bit unsure of what to do. And I think we were a bit snooty about going on the radio because we thought that was a bit of a step down or something. But actually, it was the best thing we ever did, I think. We went and started on XFM in 2003 originally, filling in for Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant when they were doing the second series of The Office. And I think we were pretty bad to begin with, didn't really know what we were doing, we weren't that comfortable with the medium. Certainly I felt very self-conscious doing live radio. I'd never done live TV before. The nice thing about doing the Adam and Joe show was that we made it all ourselves. We could get it just the way we wanted it to be, or as close as possible, before it went out. And talking off the top of my head on the radio was really difficult, I found it. Joe was more relaxed and he was very funny. But then we'd get quite unkind messages coming in, sometimes from the listeners who didn't find us funny and wanted us to play more music. But then what changed was that we started doing a podcast when we were at XFM about 2006. And the only other people that I was aware of doing podcasts then were Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant and Carl Pilkington. And so I didn't quite understand what the point of a podcast was or if there was anyone actually listening to them around that time. And there weren't that many people, I don't think. But anyway, I really liked it. And I liked the opportunity that it gave me to edit, to be a bit more careful about what went in there, to chop out some of the more unfunny and stupid things that I had said and replace them with things that made me sound funny and clever. That was good. And also I liked the opportunity to put in the jingles and stings and bits of music. I like doing all that stuff. And so when we went to BBC Six Music, which I think we did because of that XFM podcast, which was sort of successful in its own little way. And then we ended up on Six Music. And I think that really changed everything for me and Joe and made us appreciate each other again after maybe a few years of being a bit ratty with each other and not really knowing what to do as a duo. We found our feet again and it was good fun. And I loved doing the podcast, and I used to check it after it had gone up on a weekend. We did a Saturday show and the podcast would go up maybe even that night or something. I can't remember. Anyway, soon afterwards. And I would sit in my shed in Norfolk and have a glass of wine and listen to the podcast and check that it was all okay. And I quite liked it. I thought, oh, this is all right. You know, it was one of the first things that I'd done that I sort of enjoyed listening back to and appreciated and thought, yeah, that's quite close to what I would like it to be. So anyway, all that was very valuable. And then I really missed doing that when Joe got too busy to carry on doing the radio show because he was doing his movies. He was making his film Attack the Block around 2011. And I tried hosting a show with Edith Bowman, and Edith was lovely. And I really liked doing that with her, but it felt like I wasn't there yet. I needed to spend a little while readjusting to not working with Joe. And then, so after I'd left a respectful pause, I thought, well, maybe I'll start doing one just on my own and interview other people. At first, I was really keen not to have Joe on. I just wanted it to be not compared to anything we'd done together. I wasn't ready to hear people criticizing it and going, this is crap, not nearly as funny as when Joe was on it. I was really worried about reading all that, but actually it was fine. And now I'm really happy. Now it's got to a very nice point where Joe's always welcome. We do the Christmas show every year together. Louis comes on the podcast a lot. And so it's a nice mix of old friends as guests and new people that I haven't met before and people I'm interested in. Yeah, I'm really grateful for the way it's worked out.
He spoke to Edith Bowman last weekend and she said some nice things about you.
Ah, she's a lovely person. Yeah, we had a good time. I sort of felt bad that she and I worked together at a period when I was probably at my most insecure. And I've struggled with insecurity and self-doubt for most of my life. But I think at that point, Joe's film had come out. We were no longer working together. And I had no real idea of what I was going to do from that point on. And I was just a bit lost, I think, really. And poor old Edith kind of caught me at that point in my life. But it was lovely spending some time with her. I just wanted to be on my on better form. I look back and I mean, I'm always cringing a little bit when I look back at things I've done. And at that point, I just think, God, I was so up myself. I was so self-involved and worried about my own shit that I wasn't very generous with Edith at all. I think I used to just waffle on those shows and not really let her get a word in edgeways. And it wasn't... I hope I get an opportunity to work with her again and be a little more interactive, if that's the right word.
Have you had a favourite guest on the podcast?
A favorite guest? Yeah, I mean, so many. Well, one of the person who always pops into my mind when people ask me that is Tash Dimitriou, Jamie's sister, another Stath Let's Flats cast member and What We Do in the Shadows cast member. And the very first time I saw her was at a tiny club in King's Cross called the Blue Dot, maybe? No, Blue Dot is a festival. Invisible Dot, I think. I can't remember. A dot, something dot related. And she was on this bill that I was part of. I was trying out some new material. And she came on with like a Dorito costume or something. It was quite elaborate, big triangular Dorito costume. But I don't think her material was really Dorito related. She sort of came on and she looked a bit sad and a bit embarrassed that she was wearing this costume, like, oh, I'm sorry about this, you know. But there was something about her face and her delivery that really made me laugh. And I hadn't really seen that energy that she had in a lot of other comedians around that time. I like silly comedians, you know, not totally stupid. Like there's got to be an intelligence there. And there's got to be a spark, but someone who's really silly and likable with it, like Harry Hill is another person that springs to mind. And Tash reminded me of that kind of person. I just thought, she's got funny bones, but she's also, you know, emotional and sweet. And when she talks about her dad, and she's so funny in one breath, talking about her eccentric Greek father and all the funny things that he said over his life. To watch that person depart gradually. And, you know, the fact that she's able to talk about both those things, I think is very unusual. And those are my favorite kind of people who can accommodate both those things, you know.
And you did live show with
And you did a live show with Louis Theroux?
Yeah, I've done a few now. We just did one at the Apollo, the Eventim Apollo in Hammersmith, where David Bowie broke up the Spiders from Mars in 1973, I think. Or was it 74? It was around then. And that was my biggest show that I've ever done. I mean, I can't claim it was my show. Well, I suppose I can, because the audience came along not knowing who the guest would be. It was part of my live podcast tour this year, 2024. And so it was the biggest show of the run. And I knew I needed to get someone who wasn't going to be intimidated by a space like that. And actually, when I asked Louis if he would be up for doing it, he said, no, thanks. I'd rather not. That's a bit much. I mean, it's not absolutely massive. It's 3,500. So it's big enough. You know what I mean? Like, certainly for someone like me, usually most theatres I would play would be between 500 and 1,000 people. And that is certainly big enough for me. So it was a big step up. And Louis was nervous about it and just thought maybe that's stretching a good thing a little too far. And expecting too much from something that really is quite slight. You know what I mean? I.e., the conversation between two old friends. And usually the conversations I have with Louis on the podcast are quite stupid and meandering. And I mean, there's a couple of serious things we might talk about, but on the whole, it's fairly superficial stuff. And I suppose the worry was that that would just become glaringly apparent in a venue that size in front of all those people. You know what I mean? But in the end, it was great. I thought it worked really well. And we got ChatGPT at one point to generate a play about our rivalry, my rivalry with Louis, which I kind of play for laughs on the podcast, about the fact that he has entirely unnecessarily started his own very successful podcast on Spotify, and that we're now in the unpleasant position of sometimes vying for guests, which I find maddening, especially as he doesn't need in any way to do it. He's got his own thing. He's got his films. He can make his documentary films. Why he needs to come and trample on my turf is beyond me. Anyway, we did this play, and we kind of read out the play about our rivalry as it was being generated in front of the audience by the AI ChatGPT. And it worked really well, I thought. It was very funny. And actually, it had quite a few eerily genuine moments in it that were quite close to some of my genuine feelings of rivalry with Louis.
I can learn from it really right me when you're doing your research,
I've done a live show and it's difficult to gauge your material for the audience. When you're researching for a live show, do you have to do it any differently to a normal one?
Yes. I mean, the live shows that I was doing, the live podcast shows, I had a big projection screen. So I suppose that I was kind of trying to compensate for that thing of losing the intimacy that you have with a one-on-one chat. You know, when I'm recording the podcast, that's how I'd normally like to do it, ideally, just in a room with another person. And then that closeness and that intimacy and the rhythm of a conversation between two people is the main thing, and that holds your attention. But I do worry that in a live setting, because of the pressure of playing to an audience and trying to keep that many people engaged, everything becomes bigger and the intimacy is lost a little bit. And so you can only sustain their interest for so long because everything is much more superficial. You can't really go deep. You can't really, I mean, you can obviously, like skilled people can do it, but I worry that I might not be that good at doing it. So anyway, I like to have video stuff as well. And I like to have visual accompaniment. So the live shows for me were intended to work primarily for the live audience, and whether they would end up being part of a podcast episode later on, that was less important for me. So I think probably I'll cut bits of audio here and there, and I'll make them into shorter episodes perhaps, or compilations, but mainly I wanted them to work for the people who'd paid to come along and see them in the room. And so, yeah, I did quite a bit of prep for each guest and preparing slides. I do this show called Bug where I talk about music videos. And so the live podcast show was a little bit like Bug meets the podcast. It was a hybrid.
Looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
Proudest achievement? Oh, I don't know. I mean, the thing that I'm sometimes, the thing that people say to me sometimes, which is very heartening, especially after the pandemic, people said to me, you know, thanks for keeping me company in the pandemic. And I feel like you're my friend, and that we hung out together when things were bleak, when the lockdowns were happening, and when people, you know, were in a horrible place mentally. And that means a lot to me because I was in a bad place too. My mum died at the beginning of the lockdown. I felt mad. I was looking at the news. I felt frightened. I felt angry. I felt all those things that other people were feeling. And podcasts were very valuable for me too, especially silly ones, you know, ones that weren't necessarily about politics or anything else that was going on. I liked listening to the Horn Section podcast. I liked listening to Athletico Mints with Bob Mortimer and Andy Dawson. And those really cheered me up, and music really cheered me up. So I appreciate when people say that to me. And when, after my mum died and I talked to Joe on the podcast and I got very emotional, I mean, the older I get, the more difficult I find it to control my emotions sometimes. And I do get lachrymosy more and more. And I feel kind of embarrassed a lot of the time, or I feel like I don't know. I feel like you can go too far with sharing your emotions with people. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's harder, and it's maybe more valuable to be a bit more restrained. I'm not sure. I'm conflicted. But when people say like, oh, I really appreciated you keeping that stuff in, you know, when you got upset talking to Joe about your mum, you know, that I feel encouraged by that. Like, not that I want to do it more. It doesn't make me think, oh, I should definitely cry on all the episodes of the podcast from now on. But I'm glad that people feel that that wasn't an overshare and wasn't too cringy, and that was maybe it provided some connection and comfort. So I'm proud of those things, I suppose. In terms of actual kind of career highlight moments, I loved the podcasts with Joe. I loved that run of listening to those on the Six Music podcasts, and I also loved working with Radiohead for a few days when me and Garth Jennings did a couple of webcasts with them. I'm a big music fan. I love Radiohead, and being able to go to their studio that they used to have in just outside Oxford and work with them, making videos on a shoestring, like improvising little video clips for some of the songs from In Rainbows, their album that they released around that time. One of their best albums. Like, you know, sometimes you get to work with people you admire, but maybe they're not at their peak. Maybe they're
maybe it's an off day for them. Maybe that's part of the reason why they ended up working with me. But on that occasion, it was like, oh shit, we're working with Radiohead, and they've just made one of their best albums. And it was really exciting to be at the heart of that and watch them work and hang out and have butternut squash soup and help them do their webcast. And that was amazing. I loved every second of that.
And then finally, what's next for Adam Buxton?
Well, what's next immediately is I've got to finish a book. I wrote a book that came out in 2020 called Ramble Book that was kind of a memoir. I'm supposed to be writing a follow-up in a similar vein. This time I'm writing more about the work that I did with Joe in the 90s, being on TV, doing the Adam and Joe show and various other little bits and pieces. So I'm writing about that. I'm writing a bit about my mum and those lockdown times, and more stuff about just being a silly child man in my mid-50s and the challenges of coming to terms with that in the weird world.
This has been one of my bucket list things. Following the hope 8 years ago, you were things out there have a dream again.
This has been on my bucket list since starting 8 years ago. You've always been one of my dream guests.
Hey, thanks, man. I'm honored. Have we met in real life, Josh?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
But I can hear for getting you.
Thank you for giving up your time.
Oh man, I'm delighted. Let me know. Yeah, stay in touch. If you ever want to come to a show, give us a shout.
Yeah, only now, and let you know when it goes out.
I'd love that, and I'll let you know when it goes out.